Hey, Ron. Oceana. What you should have told me.
Yeah, we'll try it again sometime. Let's try a second row. Yeah.
Morning.
Not 80.
I went to get a donut. He's like, I got time.
Wax on the trees. Michigan has really pretty sleep, fall leaves. Because it's the same, if you look at all of that, it's the same, right? The only thing you don't have is those
All right. Good morning. We are starting our characteristic 5 minutes late this morning, so maybe the universe will not be mad at me. Welcome to class 10 of Is God Good? You've made it this far. I thank you. We're still here, and we're still talking, and we got a fair bit to go. So we are nearing the end of our second section of the class, and the second section is God as good as He says He is, basically, where we look at some hard passages in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and ask the question, if God is as consistent as the Christian message is, then why are these passages here, and what do we do with them? So, we've called this section, Is God a Moral Monster? That's a hat tip to a book with the same title by Paul Copan. I've gotten a lot of material from that book. It was a very helpful book for me, so if you want to dive deeper into this subject, I suggest this book. It's always in the resources section, which, by the way, if you checked your emails last night, you see that I sent you like 18 million emails because it was 10 o'clock and I said, I probably should update the class like I'm saying that I'm going to do. So last night I updated the class with all the slides and the videos, and you can access it there. Next week is our Q&A section for this class. So you can go online and you can type in a question there if you want to give me a chance to prepare. If you don't, you just want to see me make it up on the spot, you can do that too. But if you want a more in-depth answer, you might want to tell me beforehand. So you can either post it there, send me an email, or just talk to me afterwards, whatever you want to do. And I'll try to get a somewhat, at least satisfactory answer to that, if I can. All right, so we're in the second section, and the driving quote or the concept that we've been talking about is the Bible is written for us, but is not written to us. This is a quote by John Walton, who's done a lot of work on the ancient Near East. And the idea is, if we are going to understand Scripture in its own context, we have to understand the context of the ancient Near East, because it's very different than our own context, which makes some of the things that are said in the Bible very foreign to us. And it actually can make it sound almost the opposite of what it actually would have sounded like in the ancient Near East. Last week, we talked about ancient laws and women. John told me that we hit the quota for the word discharge in our Bible for the year, so I'm counting that as a win. But the two big things that we want to remember when we're looking at laws about women, or how the Old Testament talked about women, is one, remember that this is a document that was written in the ancient Near East that has a very different time and culture from our own. So we need to understand their culture to understand what they're saying. And two, on that, when you dig deeper into most of the laws about women, instead of oppressing women, most laws are there for the protection of women and other marginalized groups. Even when it doesn't sound like that on first reading, when you understand the culture and the context, those laws are actually there for the protection of women. Not that they are ideal laws, not that they are the laws that we should put up for all time and all purpose, but in comparison with the rest of the world, the rest of the ancient Near East, these laws are actually a step up and a improvement on the morality surrounding women in the ancient Near East. And this is the guiding passage that I think, this is one of the most important passages in Scripture for the topic of what we're talking about both yesterday, today, and this whole class. This is where we get the whole concept of everyone is equal, everyone is the same in the eyes of God, in the eyes of men, everyone has equal dignity and worth. It all comes from this passage. And it's Genesis 1, 26 and 27, which I'm sure we've heard many times, but I'm going to read it because it's so important. Then God said, "Let us make man in our own image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of heaven, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So this is often referred to as the Imago Dei, or the image of God passage. And again, our whole theology of equality and dignity and equal worth before God is based on this passage and other passages that support this. But without this, most people would not believe that all men are equal, and all men and women are equal. And actually, it's a really unique time and place in history that we hold that as a core value in our society, because before the Judeo-Christian worldview, or outside the Judeo-Christian worldview, it was patently apparent that all men were not equal. Some men were stronger, some men were weaker. It was very, very apparent that it was almost laughable to say that all men were equal, and especially all men and women are equal. So we'll talk about that more today, because today we are talking about slavery in the Old Testament, which is another one of those really hard questions about laws in the Old Testament. Because, as we know, slavery is a charged issue, specifically because of our context and our history in America. And when we see the laws in the Old Testament, we kind of pair those laws with our own context and our own history, and we read them through that lens, and they sound really bad through that lens. So we're going to talk about them today. But remember, this is what Jesus did when he talked about laws in the Old Testament. This is when the Pharisees came to, or the Sadducees came to Jesus, asking about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, or just marriage, divorce, really. And Jesus said that you shouldn't get divorced. And they say, well, then why did Moses allow for divorce? So they're pointing to the law, saying there's a law saying divorce is okay because it's allowed for, right? And Jesus said, no, that was there because of your hard hearts. But from the beginning, it was not so. And he points back to the beginning, to the ideal, to the garden, right? And in the garden, there was no divorce, there was no animosity, everyone was equal. There was, in the image of God, he created them male and female. So no one ruled over anybody. and they lived in harmony, right? So Jesus always pointed back to the ideal of the garden, even when there was a law in the Old Testament that made it seem like something that less than ideal was okay, right? So this is very important because that is our driving message, and that is why that is one of the reasons that the trajectory of Christianity has taken the way it has. So today we will talk about slavery, and we will start off with a really hard passage and let it sit and let us think about this passage. So Leviticus 25, 44 through 46. As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you, and their clans who are with you, that you have been born in the land. They may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you, and inherit them as possession forever. You may make slaves of them, but over your brothers, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another ruthlessly. So the hard passage, right? It literally says you may have slaves, you can buy them from the foreigners that are in your land, and you can have them forever. You can give them to your kids, they can be your property, right? So this is actually in the middle of a passage that is talking about slavery in general. The first is talking about slavery of Israelites, and then this is talking about slavery of foreigners. I personally think this is harder than the slavery of Israelites, which we'll talk about in a minute. But to make it all worse, do you know who's speaking here? It's not Moses, it's God, right? So it really seems like this is a quote attributed to God himself. This is in the giving of the law. So Exodus 20 starts with the Ten Commandments, and then he goes into the rest of the law, and he's telling the Israelites how they should live, right? And he says, you may have slaves, and you may buy them from the people who live around you. All right, so as I said, you cannot talk about this subject without talking about American slavery, because that is what we read everything through. For good reason, because that's our history, right? And that's our immediate history, and that's what we think about. When you hear the word slave, this is immediately what you think about. Now, I'm here to tell you this morning that slavery in the ancient Near East was worlds different than slavery in the antebellum South, right? And I just want to, I can't spend a lot of time to prove that to you, so you kind of have to trust me that it's very different, and we'll talk about why in a little bit. But just to kind of give you an idea of why, there are 3 laws in the Old Testament that if they actually had been heeded by American slaveholders, American slavery would not have been a thing, right? So we talk about American slavery, and we know that people on both sides of the issue use the Bible to back up their position, right? So slaveholders would say, well, the Bible says slavery is okay. It obviously is an institution that's approved of by God. We can have slaves. And then the abolitionists were also Christians, and they said that we are all made in the image of God, and we are all equal, and we should not own one another, right? So both sides use the Bible to back up their point, and that's a really important point because there wasn't a side that didn't use the Bible, as in there wasn't a secular, we throw off religion and we also throw off slavery. It was the abolitionist movement was driven by Christians, right, who had scripture for their reasons. So, but here's 3 laws in the Old Testament that if the slaveholders who said, well, the Bible endorses slavery, so we can have it, if they had actually adhered to these laws in the Old Testament, not even the New Testament, not even what Jesus said, if they had just adhered to these laws, the type of slavery that was in the American South could not have existed. So let me show you these 3 laws. You probably can't see them because they're very small, but the first one is an anti-kidnapping law, which is analogous to the slave trade. This says in Exodus 21, and whoever kidnaps somebody and sells him, or he is found in his possession, he will surely be put to death. So this is a law for the Israelites that says if you kidnap somebody to sell them into slavery, or you're even found in possession of someone who has been kidnapped, it was a capital punishment crime, right? So this law is actually reiterated in 1 Timothy 1:10. Paul has a list of vice there, and one of them is man-stealing or kidnapping. So the whole back of American slavery was built on the transatlantic slave trade, right? Which was literally kidnapping people and bringing them over. Which is in the chapter after the 10 Commandments, in the giving of the law. You cannot do that, right? So anti-kidnapping, the Old Testament was very against that. American slavery, not against that. Anti-abuse, so this is in Exodus 21 again. If a man strikes the eye of his male slave or the eye of his female slave and destroys it, he shall release him in a free place, as free in place of his eye. And if he causes the tooth of his male slave or the tooth of his female slave to fall out, he will release him as free in place of the tooth. So don't just get caught up on the eye and tooth. The point of this law, the point of this case law is if you abuse your slave and you're found to abuse your slave, you have to let your slave go free. This was a standard law in the Old Testament. The idea is just because the Israelites could have slaves did not mean they could abuse their slaves, which we know in Antebellum himself, that did not happen. And even in the ancient Near East and cultures around them, they were allowed to abuse their slaves all they want. Actually, if in like the, I think it's in the Code of Hammurabi, which is a people group around Israel, if the slave if one of the master's slave got abused, it's actually the master that compensated, not the slave. But here we see in Israel that you cannot abuse your slaves, and if you do, you must let them go free. Again, that would have made American slavery very, very, very different. And finally, runaway slaves. And you shall not hand over a slave to his master who has escaped and fled from you from his master. He shall reside with you in your midst in the place that he chooses in one of your towns, wherever he pleases. You shall not oppress him. Now, this is specifically talking about runaway slaves from foreign lands. So this is not even Israelites. This is, if there was a slave that's a foreigner that has escaped from his master, the implication is because he was being oppressed and he was being abused, he escapes. Israelites were not allowed to return those slaves. It was against law. And even if you can imagine that for a foreigner, imagine how much more if an Israelite slave ran from their master. So again, this was very different in American slavery, right? We had the whole, there was laws that you had to return runaway slaves, right? So these are just three laws in the Old Testament that if they actually had been heeded by American slaveholders, again, I believe that the institution of American slavery literally could not have existed. So people can use the Bible for all they want, but these are just the facts of the ground, right? And this is the idea that slavery was actually very different in the ancient Near East, and specifically in Israel, than what we think of when we think of slavery. So let's talk about that a little bit. Slavery in ancient Israel. There was two types. The first type was slavery of Israelites and slavery of foreigners. There's two types because there's slightly different laws based on whether or not you were a Hebrew or you were a foreigner, right? So slavery of the Israelites was voluntary, and we might think, well, how can you have voluntary slavery, which we'll talk about in a minute, but slavery was voluntary. It was debt servitude. That's probably a better word for it, like an indentured servant. And all Hebrew slaves were released in the 7th year or in the Jubilee, right? So there was a time limit that you could have slaves in the household. And in that Jubilee specifically, when you release your slaves, you had to release them with a lot of things, and they are supposed to have their property restored. So these are Hebrew slaves that should have an inheritance in the land. And in this year of Jubilee, everything goes back to zero, right? So all debts that have been incurred, everything that has built up, you erase everything. It's the year of Jubilee, everybody goes back to their own land, to their own tribe and people, and you basically get a let's start over card. That was, in theory, that was the way it was supposed to be. There's little evidence that Israel actually ever practiced the concept of Jubilee, which is really sad, because it is emphasized so heavily in the laws. So God really wanted them to do this. It seems like they might not have actually done it, which is why we'll get to Jesus in a minute. But a slavery could be made lifelong if the slave chose. So it says in the year of release, if the slave says, no, I don't want to go out because I love my master and it's good for me to be here, then you take an awl and you drive it through his ear, and he will be your slave forever. Now, again, this was the choice of the slave, which begs the question, could slavery have been really that bad? If there were slaves that said, no, I don't want to leave my master and my household, there must have been something very good for them there. Foreign slavery was a little different. Foreigners, some of it still may have been voluntary, based on if someone came into the land and then became very poor and had no money to support themselves. Also, foreigners were sometimes prisoners of war, and foreigners are often hostile to Israel, so there are actually 3 different words for foreigners. There's stranger, alien, and foreigner. And stranger and alien are usually more positive terms. They are people who reside in the land that are not hostile to Israel. Some of the strangers might even have been proselytes to the Israelite religion. The aliens are good with Israel. Like they're not hostile. Foreigners were usually hostile. They usually came to the land either for foreign business transaction, they wanted to make trades, they didn't at all adhere to any of Israelite law, or they could have been brought up as prisoners of war. So those differences will become important, but even then, they were still not to be mistreated. We'll talk about that in a minute. So, the first type of slavery was slavery of Israelites. This is a passage that kind of describes what that's like. This is in Leviticus 25. And if your countryman who is with you becomes poor and he is sold to you, you shall not treat him as a slave. He shall be with you like a hired worker, like a temporary resident. He shall work with you until the year of Jubilee. He and his sons with him shall go out from you, and he shall return to his clan, to the property of his ancestors he shall return. Because they are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as a slave. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly, but you shall revere your God. So this is how slavery works in Israel, as in slavery of the Hebrew people. If someone became poor, they could not support themselves, they would sell themselves, or they would sell somebody in their household to someone who could support them, who would give them room, shelter, food, in return for their service, right? And this was actually a way to help the poor, to bring up the poor and allow them to basically survive. But again, in the year of Jubilee, they are to be released back to their clan. Their property is to be restored, all debts forgiven. And notice the driving reason behind this. Because I, the Lord God of Israel, brought you out of the land of Egypt. So Israel has the story of the birth of Israel is the story of the Exodus, right? So Israel was slaves in the land of Egypt for 400 years. And that is their driving narrative. And you'll see throughout these laws, God will say, you are not just to mistreat the sojourner and the alien among you because you were sojourners and aliens in Egypt. You're not to mistreat your servants because you were servants in Israel, right? So that is a driving narrative of Israel, that they were a slave nation, and God has rescued them from their slavery. So they are not to oppress other people, right? Because it's the whole golden rule type thing, right? You know what it was like. You do not oppress people in the same way that you were oppressed. On that note, I'll just make a quick note. There's a book by Esau Macaulay titled Reading While Black. And it's a really great book. But he talks about how actually in the black church, they have this better perspective on the Exodus because they can identify with the Exodus, because they, just like the people of Israel, were slaves that were brought out. And he said that they have a very much more rich perspective. It's a really great book. You should check it out. But that is, again, the driving narrative of Israel. So the question is, can slavery be good? Now, to our ears, the answer is no, right? Slavery can't be good. But in ancient Israel, slavery actually was an institution that was instituted to help vulnerable people. So life in ancient Egypt was often hard and had little resources. You're an agrarian society, you're dependent on the land, and there were many, many poor people in Israel, right? There were many people that could not, maybe didn't know where their next meal was going to come from. So life was hard. Slavery was an institution that actually provided for the needs of the people. So as we saw in the last passage, if a countryman among you becomes poor and has to sell himself, you are not to oppress him, because this is the institution to help him. Slaves could become prosperous and buy their way out of debt. So it's not like their master had complete control over every single thing they did, as we would think of as slavery. It was more, again, as an indentured servitude, and at least in theory, the slave could have his own work and become prosperous and buy himself out. Also, his clansmen could redeem him out of slavery. And then, again, slaves were to be released in the 7th year, the year of Jubilee. So we just read that. This is, we're not going to read all of this for the sake of time, but this is in Deuteronomy 15. This is the law of Jubilee. And if you notice here that in the 7th year you shall send that person out free, talking about their slaves. You shall not send them away empty-handed. You shall generously supply them from among your flocks and from among your threshing floor and from your press. And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Yahweh your God has redeemed you. And then if the slave says, I do not want to go out for you because it's good for me to be here, then he can be your slave forever. But this passage just talks about when you do send your slaves out in the year of Jubilee, you're supposed to provide for them generously. You're supposed to give them basically what they would need to start out and not fall back into that, the pit of being poor and having to sell themselves again. And actually, I'm pretty sure Israel was yelled at by God and the prophets for this, because they would pretend to send their slaves out in the 6th year. Oh yeah, you're released. Wouldn't give them anything, then they would take them right back because the slaves had no way to support themselves. So it was almost this we're doing what the law says, but they're not doing the spirit of the law. So here, you're supposed to help your poor out by giving them a leg up. All right, so that was slavery of the Hebrew people. Again, slavery of foreigners was a little different. We read this passage as we beginning. This was the hard passage we read at the beginning, where it says you can buy male and female slaves from the strangers and the aliens among you. So the biggest difference here in slavery from foreigners and slavery from Israelites is foreigners didn't have the 6th year or 7th year release or the Jubilee release. That's the biggest distinction between slavery of foreigners and slavery of Israelites. Because they can be your slaves forever. So there's some things to remember before we get too far into this and think, well, that seems very racist. First of all, again, we talked about how there really weren't races in the ancient Near East. If you and I looked at a Canaanite and an Israelite, we would probably not be able to tell them apart. They looked the same, they had a very similar culture. It was more based on their religion and their own belief systems. But things to remember that even the people that were living in Israel as strangers and as sojourners, this is what God tells Israel in Leviticus 15. And when the alien dwells with you in your land, you shall not oppress him. The alien is dwelling with you, and he shall be like a native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, because you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh, your God. And then next 22, you shall not mistreat an alien, and you will not oppress him, because you were aliens in the land of Egypt. Again, Israel had this directive that they were not to oppress people that were not in Israel, right? So people that were living in their lands as aliens, as sojourners, were not to be looked down upon, were not to be oppressed, because, as we said, Israel was a stranger and alien in the land of Egypt. So they knew, they could identify with that plight, so they were not to oppress the stranger and the foreigner in their land. And again, we talked about these two laws that showed that Israel was not, even when they had foreign slaves, they were not to oppress and not to abuse their foreign slaves. The law about runaway slaves, that if someone escapes from their master, again, the implication is because they were being abused, they were not to be returned. The Israelite that found them was supposed to provide a safe haven for them. And again, slavery was not against your will, like I'm going to go kidnap somebody and bring them in. The slight difference about that is prisoners of war, which again, warfare is a whole other story in the ancient Near East, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. So, Israel was not to oppress anyone and not to oppress their slaves, because all are made in the image of God. And again, and even in this passage when we talked about, we started with a passage that says you can buy slaves from the foreign people around you, you can have them forever. This is the very next passage, the very next verse after that. It says, if a stranger or sojourner with you becomes rich, and your brother beside him becomes poor and sells himself to the stranger or the sojourner with you, or to a member of the stranger's clan, then after he is sold, he may be redeemed. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle or his cousin may redeem him, or a close relative from his clan may redeem him, or if he grows rich, he may redeem himself. So this goes to show that just because you were an alien or sojourner in the land didn't mean that you didn't have the ability to become prosperous. And here, this is a situation that an Israelite actually becomes poor and sells himself to an alien, to a stranger, which probably didn't sit well, and the law says you really should redeem them because I brought you out of the land of Egypt to not be enslaved. But again, poverty was a real problem in Israel. And we can be idealistic all we want. We can say, well, this shouldn't have been the way. But if this institution wasn't there, a lot of people would have just died, to be frank. Because people would have starved, they wouldn't have had any other means to live. So this shows that slavery went both ways. So an Israelite could buy slaves from a foreigner, but also an Israelite, if you're being poor, could sell himself to a foreigner, although that was not an ideal situation in the law. And again, the last part, if he grows rich or prosperous, he may redeem himself. So again, at least in theory, even when you're a slave, you can become rich, right? So again, very, very different than American slavery. But you might say, but what about, there's that one law, and critics will say, but what about this law that says anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but if they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. So that sounds really bad, right? So sure, you can't kill your slave, but you can get really close as long as they don't die, right? So this is a passage that a lot of critics have pulled up. And if you notice here, we're actually pulling a lot from the same sections of Scripture because a lot of criticism is made about these passages, but the Old Testament doesn't actually talk about slavery all that much. It's concentrated in these passages here. So this is a hard passage, but it's one or two, a couple verses out of a very large corpus of writing. And we'll see here that this is, I took this from the NIV on purpose, because the NIV makes this actually sound a lot worse than it actually is. So the idea here is, if you beat your slave and they die, you die, because it doesn't matter if you're a slave or free, a person is a person, and if you kill someone in Israel, that is a capital crime. So you kill someone, you die as a punishment, right? But here, if you beat your slave and they recover after a day or two, you're not to be punished. So here's what it reads like in the ESV. If a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he shall not be avenged, for the slave is his money. So I choose this verse because I think the avenge here makes it, helps us understand what this passage is saying. What this passage is saying is, if you beat your slave and the slave dies, you die. Like, that's the punishment. But if the slave doesn't die, you don't die. So again, the same word for punishment, that word is always in the Old Testament used for a capital punishment. So what it's saying is, if you beat your slave and he doesn't die, you're not to be killed. Not just you're not to be punished, you're not to be killed. So there's a lot of idea of the reasoning here for the slave is his money. One Old Testament scholar actually argues that the master here is paid for the recovery of the slave, so he's already lost a lot of money because of his actions, so that's kind of his own punishment. But even not, slavery was an institution where if your slave wasn't working, then you actually were taking economic cost in that part. So if you were to beat your slave to the point where he can work for you, then you're actually hurting yourself in this moment. So, but the point here is, it's not saying that you can beat someone as long as they don't die. It's saying if they don't die, you don't get killed, or you're not executed as a result. Does that make sense? But as we have seen in previous passages, slaves in general were not supposed to be abused, and if you did abuse your slave, you're supposed to set them free if you cause some kind of physical or harm to them. So this is just saying that maybe like the master is not supposed to be killed, but if he does beat his slave to the point that some physical harm comes about them, they are supposed to be set free because Israel is not supposed to oppress anyone. All right, so the question is, why was slavery allowed at all? And this is a common criticism from critics of the Bible to say, well, sure, you can argue all you want that slavery in Israel was worlds better than slavery both in the American South and even the people around Israel. But God's God, right? And he could just say, don't do it. So the question is, why wasn't slavery? Why was slavery allowed even in the first place? And the answer to that is it wasn't. So there is no slavery in the garden, right? And again, Jesus always points back to the ideal. So God is God, he can do whatever he wants, but we are not God, right? So God is, in fact, somewhat limited by us. It's because he's chosen to love us and to come alongside us and to lift us up and try to work with us. But that means that God has to get pretty messy and go into gray areas at times because we are not great people in general. Most people throughout history have shown that when you just leave us to do whatever we want, people will become in power and people will do bad things. So slavery was regulated in Israel, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the ideal, and it certainly isn't the ideal. So I just want to throw this point out here that the modern Western world is actually really weird in its abhorrence of slavery, which is good. That's a really good thing. I'm very for that. But we have to ask the question, why? Why is the modern world so, why is our core value against it? Because if you go back 200 years, it wasn't that way. And if you look anywhere else in the world, beyond our Western Christianized nation, it really wasn't that way. So this brings us to slavery in the New Testament, because we can talk about slavery in Rome, which was different than the ancient Near East. So this is Aristotle and Plato on slavery, their idea of slavery. This is Aristotle. He says, "For that some should rule and others be ruled is a thing not only necessary, but expedient. From the hour of the birth, some are marked out for subjugation, others for rule. And indeed, the use made of slaves of their tame animals is not very different, for both with their bodies minister to the needs of life." So Aristotle says it's just a fact of life that some rule and some are to be ruled. And this was just as apparent as the sun rises every morning, which is really hard for us to understand because the opposite is true for us. It's just as apparent as the sun rises that this should not happen for us. But for Aristotle, it was you could just look out and see, and that was just a fact of the world. Plato says the same thing. Nature herself intimates that it is just for the better to have more than the worse, and the more powerful than the weaker. And in many ways, she shows among men as well as among animals, and indeed among the whole cities and races, that justice consists in the superior ruling over and having more than the inferior. It was just nature. It's literally a fact of the world. You can look out and you can see it. And again, this is like we read these passages, we read these sections, and we're like, how can you think that? Like, how can you even think that and believe that you are a moral, upright person? And these were the two people that kind of defined morality in the Greek and Roman worlds. Like, if you wanted to talk about moral philosophers, you talked about Aristotle and Plato, right? And it's because Christian values see everyone as made in the image of God. Male and female, he created them. There was no slavery in the garden. There was no oppressor, there was no inferior, there was no superior or inferior. Actually, it wasn't until the fall where it says that man shall rule over the woman. And it was as a point of the fall, and it was not a point of the original intent in the garden. It doesn't say man shall rule, it's saying it's a fact that that's what's going to happen now. There is this power dynamic because of the fall. So a lot of people say, well, Jesus never said anything about slavery. Why didn't he condemn it? If you're saying all these things, he kind of did. So this is Jesus in Luke 4, and this is the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, which was given to him. And unscrolling the scroll, he found a place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because of which he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of the sight of the blind, to send out in freedom those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord." So you remember how I said that there doesn't seem to be any evidence that Israel actually practiced the year of Jubilee? which is really sad. Jesus came to be the year of Jubilee, to be Jubilee. He came to set the captive free and proclaim release to the oppressed, right? Switch those around. You can read it in the verse. So Jesus came to be the year of Jubilee. Then a lot of people will point to Paul and say, well, Paul certainly seems like he was all for slavery. He could have said, hey, stop owning people, but he didn't, right? But again, you have to read Paul, and when you read Paul, you realize that he kind of did say that, just not in explicit words. So this is in Galatians 3:27-29. For as many of you were baptized into Christ and put on Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And then in 1 Corinthians, where he's talking about the church and living as they were called when they became Christians. Were you a bondservant when you were called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who is called in the Lord was a bondservant is a freeman in the Lord. So basically, Paul is saying, if you were a slave when you became a Christian, don't worry about it because you're free in the Lord. If you can gain your freedom, that's great, you should do it. But don't let it get you down because God doesn't view you that way. This is often what critics will point to, why Paul is said to adore slavery. This is the household clothes. Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart as in Christ. Peter says something very similar to slaves, saying, obey your masters as Christ, basically to show a good example to them. But this is the scandalous part of the household code down the bottom, where Paul then addresses masters, and he says, and masters, do the same things to them, and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. So basically, he turns to masters and says, now masters, you are to do the same things that your slaves are to do to you. And basically, he's putting masters and slaves on equal footing here, even if the institution is still there. And then he says, because your master is in heaven, and their master is in heaven, and there's no partiality between them. So God doesn't see it that way. Like, you might see it that way right while you're here right now, but God doesn't see it that way. And then the letter to Philemon, sure, Paul doesn't say, okay, slavery is bad, let's not do it anymore. But if you read the letter to Philemon about a runaway slave that he sends back, Paul equates, he says, I'm sending Onesimus back, but not as a slave, as a brother. Like, he will technically still be a slave, but you are supposed to treat him as your brother. No longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother. And if you regard me as a partner, accept him as you would accept me. Like, these are scandalous words in the Roman world where slavery was just apparent, right? So, why was slavery allowed at all? Especially in the New Testament. And the idea is that Christians were a very, very small part of society in the ancient world. And they had no power. They had no political power. They had no power in the arena, basically. So it's almost like saying, hey, you people that are here at Y Station, it's your job to stop the institution of American football. Like, it's your job, it's just bad. We should all stop it. There's no way we can do it. Now, we can say, now we all will stop watching it, or we all will stop doing the bad things that come from it, and amongst ourselves in our community we'll stop. But there's no way we could actually affect that to the broader world. So that's kind of the position Christianity was in the first century. So Paul takes the legs out of slavery. He says, the institution still exists, but amongst us it's irrelevant. Because we are all equal before Christ. We are all brothers and sisters. So early Christians uplifted the slaves and removed the legs of the institution. If you know much about early Christianity, you know that early Christianity was mostly composed of women and slaves. So for the critics who say that Christianity was so bad for women and slaves, apparently the women and slaves in the first century didn't understand that. Because they came to Christianity in droves because there was something into the message of Christ that was good for them. And ultimately, I don't have time to prove this, but you can go out and look it up on your own. Ultimately, it was Christianity that ended slavery in the modern world. So if you ask the question, why are we so weird today, that one of our core values is that slavery is bad, you can thank the Christian message for that. And I'll let you do your own homework on that because we are way out of time. Thank you. Next week, we will do a Q&A. Again, if you have questions, please give them to me. And if you want me to go over anything in more detail here, just let me know next week and we can do that. Thank you.